It's strange thinking back to the early 2000s at the height of Bright Eyes' popularity and the unceasing comparisons that were made between Conor Oberst and Bob Dylan. Since Bright Eyes was disbanded in 2011, but realistically also in the dying years of that band, we've seen Oberst increasingly settle into his comfort zone of indie pop rock. Instead of progressing with what was once a spark of intense originality, these early jagged edges have gradually been sanded down to a smooth, refined finish, a far cry from Dylan's own trajectory. Salutations is over an hour of music, comprised of full band re-recordings of his earlier Ruminations album, with some new songs thrown into the mix. That's a lot of music, especially since we've already heard much of it before, and in more ways than one. While the band sounds great, and there's nothing really wrong with this record, everything is a little bit too familiar. There are no great surprises, musically, lyrically, or syntactically, that rival some of the more revelatory moments across Conor Oberst's discography. It's all too safe and unambitious, which is the last thing Oberst needs right now. Ruminations was raw and stripped back. It was the logical product of Oberst's singer-songwriter narrative and a breath of fresh air after so many years of post-Bright Eyes pop albums that weren't particularly distinguishable from one another. Most importantly, it was a compelling statement to witness. In returning to his more familiar, large indie band sound, with all the polish that entails, Salutations lacks that same purpose. What could have been a worthwhile reimagining of old songs just sounds like a choice made from a lack of options and vision. Salutations sounds pretty, but ultimately there's not much here that hasn't been heard before.
It still sounded like a Bright Eyes album, only with a little less despair in the instrumentals. Maybe it's just his voice being a little bit too recognizable if he suffers from that problem, but there's something somewhat too self-aware in Oberst's voice as a singer and a writer that has always somewhat turned me off from his music. It's almost like he knows when he's writing exactly how his audience are going to react. You know, I feel like in the emo genre, and I am going to place him within there, what's sort of charming about a lot of these songs is their clumsy honesty. And it's like, the thing about Oberst's authorial voice is it's almost too competent. It's almost too deliberate and self-aware, and I think that makes him somewhat unapproachable, because as a listener, I feel a little bit manipulated at times.
Yeah, he's definitely become more measured as time's gone on, and I think he's tried to become this kind of great lyricist, whereas in the early days he was really just, as you say, a very honest lyricist, and really seeking to reflect a lot of things that were happening to him, casting that through the mold of characters and these sort of narratives that were evolving from that. And as time's gone on, he's kind of lost a lot of that momentum, and now he's trying to settle into more of a great speaker kind of mold. And honestly, I think that as time's gone on, we've seen that he doesn't actually have the chops to back that up.
Ultimately, the artist, of course, makes the decision to confine themselves within a certain, parameter of making music. But I'm wondering if maybe his adherence to that genre has inhibited him from growing as an artist. Because, I personally don't think that he plays around with different sounds in the ways that he probably could. He has a pretty secure fan base, despite controversies which have definitely tainted his career over the past decade. He still has a consistent group of people who will listen to Oberst because they love Bright Eyes or have made the jump with him from Bright Eyes to his solo work. So I'm wondering what would keep him, an artist who wants to be, the next Dylan or has been dubbed the next Dylan, what is keeping him within this sort of safe genre? He's clearly a very competent songwriter and musician, so what's holding him back?
There's definitely an evolving importance of the band in giving the music form, and Salutations really exposes that process, going from Ruminations, which is very, very stripped back, very, very raw, taking those same songs and then giving them this form in Salutations where it's this hugely ornate and bigger sounding record. It exposes that progression and demonstrates the importance, I think, in the band in creating this music now. And I think that's very much a focus. I just don't think it's a particularly interesting focus.
Yeah, me neither. In listening to the album, I didn't hear a lot of standout tracks, to be completely honest with you. And maybe I should have listened to it a couple more times in order to familiarize myself with it better. But I don't know. I've always listened to Bright Eyes. I felt like this should have been me revisiting an old friend, but I didn't hear that old friend having progressed or grown since the last time we spoke. which was a bit disappointing.
It's a strange thing for me, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this. What do you see as the main shift between doing a Bright Eyes album and doing a Conor Oberst album? Because as far as I can hear, particularly in the dying period of Bright Eyes, there's no distinct difference between the music he's writing.
I agree with you. See, whenever I think of a musician creating a solo work, I always think of it as this musician is taking a break from the band's vision in order to stoke their own and cultivate their own ideas for what they want their music or their voice or their message to be, separate from the band. You know, it's supposed to be a little bit different. Maybe they wanted to explore a different genre, which Oberst obviously didn't want to do. Or, you know, maybe they want to work with different guest artists. And he did have quite a few guest producers and musicians on this album. For Oberst and a lot of these musicians, particularly of the emo genre, their music is very teen angst centric. So I think that the expectation, at least on my part, would be that Oberst's solo work was an opportunity for him to showcase his maturity and maybe his adult angst, if appropriate. But I heard that lyrically, but sonically, I didn't hear that much of a difference. And maybe his personality was just so big on Bright Eyes' later records that they might as well have been solo Oberst albums. But yeah, I didn't hear that much of a difference between later Bright Eyes stuff and Salutations / Ruminations, I guess.
Yeah, it's a shame too, just because I guess Ruminations was such a distinct standout in that catalogue. All of a sudden, you had something that was just really interesting, just because it sounded different, and even sounded pretty different compared to most Bright Eyes offerings, I guess, excluding perhaps some of the really early unlistenable records he put out.
Yeah.
And to sort of regress back into this very familiar sound is just, I don't know, it doesn't offer anything, I don't think, and it makes it very hard for me to enjoy listening to this album in some ways. Just, I'm bored. I'm bored throughout much of it because you're not giving me anything new. And you don't always have to be doing new stuff, but it has to feel like there's a reason for this stuff to exist. There's no really distinctive voice here beyond what I've been listening to for the last 10 years. Outside of sort of Oberst's residual fan base, I don't know if there's a lot of people clamoring for this music. And I don't think it really contributes anything to that either. So it's kind of a double veil of pointlessness to me.